What is your name, what are your pronouns, and what are you going to talk about today?
So I'm Lee Fallon and I am a lecturer in education studies. My pronouns are he, him, and today I'm here to talk about being an adoptive parent.
Could you please give us an adoption 101?
Where to start with adoption? I guess the big question that I always get is how adoption works and why did I do it? A lot of people are a little bit nervous to ask, or they make assumptions, so I'll give a really quick overview of how it works, and hopefully that will be useful for anyone who's maybe thinking of adoption, or you might have a friend or a colleague who's going through the process, and it'll give you a general idea of how it works. So if someone's looking to adopt, there's generally a couple of routes. You can go through a charity or organisation, or you can go through, like Barnardo's is a good example, or you can go through a local authority. So I went through the local authority route with my husband and we adopted with One Adoption, and that's basically a conglomerate of North East Lincolnshire, East Riding of Yorkshire, Hull City Councils working together for adoption. All of these agencies and councils generally work through a three-phase approach. Your first approach is they'll come and meet you, they'll have a little interview with you to find out what your motivations are, they'll look at your house and just get a feel for your kind of context, and that's stage one. They'll write a little report and that's usually signed off by a manager in the adoption team, and you move to phase two. Phase two is a much more thorough scrutinising of your entire life, your social network, everything about you. There'll be police, DSB checks, there will be credit referencing checks, there will be medicals, they'll speak to your employer, they'll speak to your friends, your family, and they'll speak to you an awful lot. So we had about 10-hour meetings, and that's 10-hour-long meetings, and they speak to you about everything that you could imagine, why you want to adopt, your motivations to adopt, your attitudes to parenting, and some really challenging questions around the kind of kids that they think that you can support. That all gets written up into a big report, and you then go to a panel, and that's really nerve-wracking. That panel will decide, can you as a single adopter, or you and your partner as a couple adopt, and how many children would be suitable and what ages would be suitable for you. So it's a big day. And then after you get that approval, you go through the weirdest phase ever, which is matching, and that is you looking at very short profiles of children or sibling groups to decide whether or not they could be right for you. And it is wonderful and horrible at the same time. You're kind of shopping for children. It's about finding the right match for you, and it's hard because at some point you will have to say no. So if you're going through that yourself, it is really hard, but it's also a very emotional thing for people going through adoption, because it's their future family, their hopes, their dreams. They really want those children, but you've got to be selfish as well. You've got to find the right match for you, because if it's not the right match for you, it's not the right match for the kids. So it's about working through for everybody. So you'll find that match, and then you'll find out more about those children, you'll get more information about them, you will maybe meet their foster carer. Some agencies will let you meet the children or see them, and that works really differently from different agencies. With One Adoption, we were actually able to meet the children, and they did a bump into meeting. So essentially the foster carer and my children were taking a walk in the park, and then me and my husband just bumped into them and, oh, hi, lovely to meet you, foster carer, friend for life. And you basically role play knowing the foster carer and get to hang out with the kids. And that's really important, because the kids cannot know why you're there, because that could lead them to be not chosen if the bump into doesn't go well. So it's always very low key as an event, and that's why sometimes it's just seeing the kids. For us, we really felt that connection, and that's when you then go through all of the additional paperwork and questions, and it's a bit like revisiting stage two, except for the question is, why are you, either as a single adopter or you as a couple, the right match for these kids? and then you go to another panel, and that panel makes the biggest decision of your life. Will those kids move in with you? And that is nerve-wracking. And if that all goes through, it's then signed off by an agency decision maker, and those kids will move in with you. And it tends to be a very long process, so it's not uncommon for it to take 1 or 2 weeks of transition, where on day 1 you'll go for like a cup of tea at the foster carer's house and say hi to the kids. Day 2 a couple of hours, day 3 you stay for lunch, so it builds it up and up and up. And then for the second week it will reverse role, and they'll start to come to you for an hour, then for a couple of hours, and then maybe on day 3 the foster carer will leave them at your house. And then at the end of that process, the foster carer brings them to your house and then doesn't come back. And that is a huge moment, because then those kids are in your care. And again, it's not a big deal made about that, because the kids can't know they're experiencing another loss. It's just a smooth transition for them. And then you're essentially looking after these kids. Your social workers will check in with you weekly, then fortnightly, then monthly. And then after a set amount of time, I believe it's 10 weeks as a minimum, but most often much, much longer, you can go to the courts to apply for that formal adoption. Another nerve-wracking moment, because at this point a judge is going to decide, are you going to be the permanent legal guardian of these kids? And that will issue you with an adoption certificate that replaces their birth certificate, and you are free of social workers, and those kids are legally your responsibility forevermore. And as you can imagine, I have gone through all 3 of those steps and through the court proceedings with my husband, and we are now the parents of 3 very beautiful children.
Could you tell us if there are any other routes into adoption?
Yeah, absolutely. Another common and really growing route is foster to adopt, or as they call it now, early permanence placement. And essentially you go through the stage 1-2 process, but at stage 3 the matching is incredibly quick. You would essentially get a phone call maybe on a Sunday, and they would say, there is a 2-year-old we're going to remove from family, can they move in with you on Tuesday? You get very little details about that child or children, and you would become that child's foster carer. So you would be fostering them, you'd receive fostering allowance, you'd be supported as a foster carer, and essentially early permanence placement is designed where social workers have a really, really, really good idea that this child will be placed for adoption. So ultimately you'll foster them, and when that child becomes flagged for adoption, you'd be matched with them automatically and go through the same adoption process. It's beneficial because it means that that child has less transition. So they move to foster care, and that foster carer becomes their placement. So it's a fantastic route for children, far less disruption and much more support. But it's a risk for those adoptive parents, because at the end of the day the legal proceedings are not complete, and that child could end up going back to live with their parents. And that's a really important thing about the whole adoption system. It is about trying to make families complete, and that first attempt will always be made with blood relatives, essentially, to try and keep those families whole. It's a real serious process.
How has being an adoptive parent affected you personally?
It's life-changing, and actually I think on a whole the transition isn't that different between becoming a parent through birth as to becoming a parent through adoption, because ultimately at the end of the day you become a parent. So seeing the world different because you're thinking of your children and protecting your children, or rediscovering your world through your child's eyes, is the same for both an adoptive approach as is a normal birth. So I think fundamentally that's the important thing. It's just another route to parent, and it's just another form of family, and that difference doesn't have to be highlighted. But it does have a few extra things that we need to consider. So you choose your child. That's different. You know, it's a magical conversation being able to talk to your son or daughter and say, I chose you, we wanted you, we fought for you. And I think we also have to be completely open and honest about children that are available for adoption. the vast majority of children in our system have gone through a bad experience, and let your imagination take you from there for the things that some of these children have gone through. It's almost unheard of that a mother gives birth and says, I do not want this child, please adopt them. The vast majority of children in the system are removed from parents because they have been abused, neglected, not looked after, and put in a dangerous or a risky position. So yes, you're becoming a parent, but you are becoming a parent of somebody who has had a rough start in life, and depending on what age they were taken away from parents and at what age you adopted them, those experiences can have lifelong repercussions. So fundamentally you're a family, and fundamentally you're a parent, and you're just going to become a parent like any other parent. But there's also a likelihood with adoption that you will be taking in a child that has a lot of catching up to do developmentally, and they've got a lot of things they're going to need to talk through and work through with you. So you need to be ready for that, and you will come across some grim stories along the way. But the big thing about adoption is there's hope at the end of it, because that child, if successfully adopted, has that secure family. If you're the people adopting them, you made that happen and you get your family that way as well.
Have you felt you've been marginalised or stereotyped due to being an adoptive parent?
No. I think it's important to flag, as you've probably guessed, I am a gay adoptive parent, so it was me and my husband that went through the adoption route. You do get some stereotypes around adoption. People always assume that people are adopting because they've got fertility problems, because they're part of the LGBTQIA community, or a whole raft of other things. Yeah, people make assumptions all of the time, but actually there's a whole raft of motivations why people want to adopt or foster. My own 5-year-old son, when he grows up, wants to become a foster carer. You know, he at such a young age recognises the value that he had from being fostered and being in that safe environment, and he wants to give that to another person. There are some people who choose to go down the adoption route because they know that there are so many children that need that loving home, and they want to provide that for them. So you do get a whole raft of assumptions. I guess it's fair to say that sometimes there are some damaging narratives around being a gay parent that is problematic, and I have to say we didn't experience any problem from any colleagues, from the university, from students. It's been a really supportive environment for us, and importantly the adoption agency, One Adoption, were absolutely fantastic. I think they said that it's normal for them to be placing 20 to 30% of children with LGBTQIA families. They were so incredibly helpful for the whole process. And they did ask us questions, but it was always pertinent questions about how we would cope. So for example, we have a daughter, so they were asking quite legitimately, you know, are there female figures in your life, in your friendship group, in your community that she would be able to go to if she needs help and support? And that was a really good conversation that we were able to have, you know, to talk about how we would support our daughter. But it's also important to acknowledge there are single parents that have to have that same, you know, use of their wider network to support their children as well. So we've had no issues whatsoever. Even the school and the nurseries have been absolutely fantastic. So, for example, way before our children were placed with us, they started to buy books with LGBTQ families in them so that they could start seeing those kind of different family makeups in books before they were introduced to their new daddies. The schools have continued that with all of the kids in the class so that my children never feel left out, and that they know that families look differently, and some people have a mummy, some people have a daddy, some people have a mummy and a daddy, some people have two daddies, some people have two mummies, some people have a foster parent, some people have grandparents. Families come in so many different shapes and sizes. So I've not experienced any issue. I know my husband hasn't. Will those things come in the future? Probably. We will have those challenges in the future, but I think we're ready for them, and we've got off to a really good start. And it's having that dialogue so that your children can be confident in themselves to deal with those things and switch them off if it's not helpful for them.
Could you do some myth busting about stereotypes surrounding being an adoptive parent?
Well, myth busting. I guess there's so many, and I think part of it is because the process has changed so much. So, we have a relative in our family who adopted, and they were pretty much like, here's a baby. That doesn't happen anymore. The process is much more rigorous, and I think part of this links to the nature of children in the adoptive system as well. There's a lot of neglect and abuse that has led people into there. So I think if we're brutally honest, adoption's this wonderful end where you make a whole family, but actually to make a new family you've got to break a previous one. So we often get a lot of people saying like, oh, you're wonderful, you're adopting, this is amazing, but at the back of your head you're like, but I'm also robbing another family of their child or children. It's a real serious thing, It's hard. It's really, really hard when you've got at the back of your head that your happiness and success is based on fracturing somebody else's family. But that's why that system is so incredibly serious. That's why there are so many checks in place. That's why adoption is the last resort. So yes, it's this magical end, but there's a lot of hardship quite often for those kids until they get to that point. And as I said earlier, very few children are surrendered. Some people might, adopt a step sibling, for example. The vast majority of children have been forcibly removed from family. So there's often a lot of trauma-informed parenting required. There's a lot of understanding, a lot of patience. The children might have additional medical needs or social, emotional, mental health needs. That might require more time as a parent. There might be additional appointments and things like that. So I think sometimes those grittier bits get papered over, but the adoption process prepares you for that so that you're ready to go through it. But I think if you are supporting somebody through adoption as a friend, a colleague or a manager, you've got to bear in mind there's that grittier side as well. People are going to be going to training sessions and learning about things like fetal alcohol syndrome and how some children are so severely damaged by the parenting that they've received or not received prior to adoption as well. So it's not like, yeah, you're going to get a baby, woo! It's hard. There's also a lot of older children in the system. A lot of people go in wanting very, very young children. They want babies. The advantage of that is there is less parental trauma potentially, but also there can also be a lot of damage prenatal as well. So there's also a lot of unknown with adoptions around that age group. For me and my husband, it was a conversation that we had, and we actually chose to go for an older age group. So we said anywhere from birth to 7 we'd be willing to adopt, because we recognised there was an awful lot of older children in the system who really, really needed that help and support. And obviously there are older kids than 7, there's all the way through up to teenagers, and that was a difficult conversation for us as well. We just didn't feel like we were in the right support to support a teenager or an older child. We didn't have it wasn't the right phase for us. Again, it's being selfish to find the right thing for you, because if it's not right for you, it won't be right for the kids as well. So I guess there's a whole range of emotions that go on around adoption. There's a lot of awful things as well as that wonderful end to adoption as well. And it's hard, as I said, your success is based on somebody else's failure, and that rings at the back of your head, but you remember at the end of the day, they had their chance. The vast majority of children that are in their system, their families would have received every help and support to help them stay together as a whole. And it just didn't work out in that case. And their loss is your gain, ultimately. I guess another really big myth as well is around the level of support that you get. So, as we've said, some of these children might have some very, physical, social, emotional and mental health needs that you need to support them through. And there is lots of support in place for that. So when you initially adopt those children, if there's anything medical, they'll get the exact same support as any child would through the NHS. And actually they get a kind of a bit of a priority bonus in some ways. So for example, my children really struggled to get them a dentist, but because they were wards of the state at that point, we hadn't fully adopted them, there was an agreement in place with the local authority that there was one dentist that had to take them, so they were a shoo-in straight for the dentist. The second those kids moved in with us, that all of the things that they need, like speech and language support, all of that support was very, very forthcoming. When you have those children initially placed with you, there is a weekly check-in from the social workers. It usually alternates between your children's social worker and your social worker. That will then branch to fortnightly and then monthly until the court order is eventually granted. And they're there just to make sure everything's okay and do you need any additional help or support. There's definitely more support when you're in that phase. So my recommendation to anyone would be, if your family or your children need anything, do not go through the court proceedings, get everything in place. At that point, there's still the responsibility of the state. The state might have handed some stuff to you, but get all that support in place before you adopt them. That's really, really important. Once you have adopted them, there is also after adoption support. So there's a phone number in my phone. I've never needed it, but there is after adoption social worker support. My children have some additional funding for therapy, so the social workers help us apply for that, and that's a fantastic offering that's really helping support my children, and that's something that I'm really, really happy we've got help with. And I guess, again, it comes back to just like any normal parental experience, you've got your friends and your family, and they are just as much a part of your children's life as if you had had them through a natural birth or even surrogacy. So for me, our relatives, particularly our neighbours have been unending levels of support for my kids. So Auntie Lam and Auntie Caroline are on hand anytime my kids need anything, and it's a really important role model for my daughter as well, for her to have a woman in her life, given that she's got two gay dads. There's going to be some things I want her to feel comfortable to talk to me and my husband about anything. I also acknowledge there might be some things she will want to speak to a woman about, so I'm really happy that she's got that in her life as well. Okay, now the biggest myth: do I need to tell my children they're adopted? That is the biggest one that you see going around. And you will even see some people entering the system saying, I'm not going to tell my children they're adopted. It is so incredibly important that we are open and honest with young people and children about their family makeup. That is incredibly important. So the advice of every adoption agency and local authority is to be open, honest and transparent about adoption and that adoptive process. If you try to lie about it and say, I'm your genetic parent, that will come out at the end of the day. There is no way to keep that secret. It will come out. So that open and honesty and transparency is really important. And it's about the well-being of that child. That child deserves to know where they came from. They deserve to know the full background. And one thing that generally every agency and charity will do is they will produce your children a picture book, which is their adoptive journey, and that will have details of their birth family, their foster carers. There might be little keepsakes in there, like a little lock of hair and little things like that. And that book is an aid memoir for you to talk to your children about the journey they've been on and how they came to live with you. Some of those books are very, very full of lots of detail. Some of them are not, depending on how much the family engage, how many photos and stories they share. But those books are incredibly important. And every child will also receive a letter for later on in life. And that's for when they are ready for the full detail of what they've gone through. And that letter will be written by their social worker and will go through all of the detail of why they have got to where they are. It is very, very rare for there to be an exception to the following. But generally speaking, every adoptive parent will have to inform the birth family of how the kids are doing. This is not through direct contact, it's usually through what they call letterbox contact. So, for example, me and my husband, once a year, every year, write a letter to the parents and we just give them a vague update. You don't include any details like what school they're at or how they're doing. Anything that could potentially put them at risk is left out of there. Those letters are sent to the agency or the charity, and they will check to make sure there's nothing that would potentially expose you or anything inappropriate in there, and they would then send that on to family, translating it if necessary. And then the same in reverse, the birth family have the option to write back via the local authority. And they will even, if parents have low level of literacy, they can go in and a social worker will write it for them. So there's lots of opportunity, and that's really important for those birth family as well, because they are undergoing a monumental loss. The vast majority of adoptions will cease contact with all birth family. There might be some exceptions, so for example, there may be a sibling pair and they're adopted separately, so there may be a requirement that there's contact between those siblings, between foster carer and an adoptive parent and yourself. But there is still that contact, and that contact is important. A birth family that's entitled to the contact and is not receiving it can go to court, and you will be ordered by a judge to engage in that process. So honesty, openness and transparency is really, really important. And it's kind of, for me, it's about not making a deal about it. We mention adoption continually, all of the time, so that it isn't seen as something that we've got to keep secret or something that's different. It's just a normal part, it's a thing that happens regularly. So having those conversations with the children all of the time so that they feel really secure and they know that ultimately we've chosen them and they're now ours and we are a family and this is how our family was made. And as they get older, there'll be difficult conversations when it's the right age to tell them details, and that's something all adoptive parents need to go through as well. But that's probably the biggest myth. Can you hide adoption from children? No, not really. The only really important thing is that when you're having those conversations, if it's not your adoptive child, you take the lead from the parent, because the parent will be talking through things at their own timeline, and that's really important too.
How could the people around you and the university do better or help you more?
I guess it's having that conversation. So how can we help you? Because actually those needs are going to be different for every single person, whether they're an individual adopter or they're adopting as a couple. So just ask. I think the key thing is not to make any assumptions, because it's going to vary for everybody. Funnily enough, the number one way to help initially is quite often to stay away, because there will be some paternity and adoption leave quite often, and that's really safeguarded time to bond with the kids. And it's really important that no other family or friends are around. Those kids have to attach to you, almost like push out the family dog aside as well. They really need to attach onto you, and they might attach at different rates. I remember our youngest hooked onto my husband in 3 days. That level of attachment took months for him to build up with me, but that was okay. My elder children attached to me a little bit more than my husband originally. Again, it happens at different paces, so patience is really, really important. For the university, I had a really, really good time because I had a very open and honest dialogue with my line manager. I explained to them what I was going through and what I'd need, and it's a lot. There was a lot of meetings to prepare. They weren't particularly aware of all of the meetings, so actually outlining that and having the discussion, how can we do this? And we used the flexible working policy at the time to help me navigate all those meetings, because it's an hour here, a half an hour call there. You don't really need to be taking full days and half days of leave if you can help it. And that's, I guess, one of the things I'm really excited about. I've been working with the ED&I team over the last year and with other colleagues to help produce a better version of our adoption policy, which is part of the wider family leave and benefits policy. And it's coming out soon. And I'm fairly confident it's going to be something that's incredibly progressive, supportive, and potentially one of the best policies to support adoption out of any employer that I've seen. And that's exactly what our university should be doing as an anchor institution for our region and as an institution that is pushing social justice. There are a lot of children in our region and the immediate counties that need help, so it's the responsible thing to do to help facilitate adoption within our organisation, and I am so incredibly proud that my employer does that. And it already did. When I had that first conversation with my social worker, me and my husband were asked who you're employed by, what's your work, and the second I said I work for the University of Hull, my social worker said, fantastic, I've adopted loads of children who parents work at the university, and it's a really good employer. And I aspire for us to be the best employer in the region for that, and I think we're going to get there.
How do you feel the media represents adoption?
That's a really good question. Do you know, I think there's a whole range of different representations, but I can tell you of a couple that have really stood out to me. The first is Instant Family, which is an American movie and is set in the American context, but it perfectly represents that it's ultimately an instant family. That beautiful moment when they take the 3 kids home and they're like, what do we do? That they're ours now. And you go through that. I remember the first time me and my husband did bedtime and we sat downstairs and we barely dare make a sound for fear of waking them up. I'm like, they're our responsibility now. Are we parents? This is a thing. So that movie really spoke to me, and the process is different, but there are some similarities. So, for example, we did go to group training as part of our process, but there was a lot more individual coaching with our social worker to get to know us and to make sure that the fit was right. We also didn't go to one of those kind of adoption fairs that you see in the movie, but they do exist. It's a lot to go to an event like that. But there are some children that they may be struggling to place, and those fairs can be a supportive way to do that, but they do happen over here. But generally speaking, most of it's happened within an agency or a local authority. The second one that really speaks to me is on Apple TV, and I think it's called Trying, and it is a wonderful series about a couple that are adopting, and they're in London, so it's very much based around the UK system. Yeah, there's a couple of little differences in process from agency to agency, but I think it's a really good representation of that kind of UK context, and you see that wider support network as well. I won't give you any spoilers for it, but the importance of family and friends to help you through that is really, really important. I think the media's taking a lot more steps to positively represent adoption, and I think it's important to look past just television. The fact that I can go and buy a book that has 2 mums in it or 2 dads is so incredibly important, because my kids can see a family like theirs in books. I've had to have a few conversations with the boys before, and they've been like, look daddy, that boy has 2 daddies as well. And I'm like, we don't know that. It could be an uncle, it could be a brother, we don't know. Let's not make an assumption about people's relationships. But it's so important for kids to see children like them. And that's really important, and that's not just about adoption, but it's to do with race and faith and religion and a whole range of different things. So anything that we can do to increase representation is really, really important. And I think one of the really beautiful things about a lot of the books that do cover kind of adoptive parenting, they tend to be quite inclusive. So they show mixed race families, multi-faith families, they show LGBTQIA parents as well. That is incredibly important. I guess one of the final frontiers is probably kids' cartoons. Anytime you see that kind of representation, the certain parties and politics and groups will always rally against that and talk about indoctrination. There's a very different feel from a book somebody's chosen to get from the library or chosen to buy a child versus something that might crop up on television. And there's a long way to go with that, to see that broader representation. But that's not just to do with adoption, that's to do with everything. You know, as I've said before, I'm not just a adoptive parent, I'm a gay man, a married gay man who has adopted with somebody else, with my husband. So it's in all of those elements of representation, not just of adoption and of fostering, but of those diverse families as well.
Is there anything else you would like to say, or anything else you would like anyone to know about adoption?
I guess this might slip in somewhere earlier, but I guess a question early on could be, what was your adoption journey? So I give the adoption 101, but that was quite process oriented. So my adoption journey, well, me and my husband, very early in our relationship, had always talked about wanting to have children, and ultimately as a gay couple, you look at either surrogacy or you look at adoption. And for us, there was no way we were going to look at surrogacy when there were so many children in our immediate area who needed a family, and we knew we could provide that for them. So that conversation happened way before we were engaged, you know, just to, you know, when you're dating and you're making sure your goals align. We had an initial engagement with the adoption agency when we were engaged, and they said, we like you, just be together a bit longer. I was studying my doctorate as well, so when we revisited the idea a year later, I was right in the throes of write-up. So in the end, we re-engaged them 3 years later, and they said, why did you take so long? So we went through that process. We attended an information session, weren't scared away, went to all the training and the auditing and the panels, and we weren't scared away. But through phase 1 and phase 2, we made a decision that we wanted to adopt a sibling group. That's because we knew we wanted more than one child. We knew we didn't want to go through the process more than once, and we knew that there were countless sibling groups that they are struggling to place with. So it was like a win-win-win-win-win situation. We'd help siblings stay together, we'd get the children we always wanted, a sibling group. So we were approved to adopt 2 children aged 1 to 6. And you go through the matching process, and we went through some really difficult things where it's like, how do we make a decision on this information? Like, how do we say no? How do you turn down a child? But you do, you know, you've got to find that right match. And eventually a profile landed, and it was 3 children, and we're like, no. Let's ask our social worker about this. So we had a few questions, we had a dialogue, then we spoke to their social worker, and the next thing we knew, everyone was in our house and we were talking about these kids, and their social worker loved us and we really liked them. And then we met their foster carer, and then a couple of weeks later we met them, and that was like all the feelings. I remember me and my husband stood in this park being like, what do we say, what do we do, like, and that was for a bump into meeting. So the kids had no idea we were looking at adopting them, they were completely unaware. As far as they were aware, we were walking, so was the foster carer, and we just bumped into each other as friends. And that was the profile we went for. So you found out more, you speak to their doctors, their teachers, their nursery staff, you speak to their foster carer, to their social worker, to everyone involved in those children's life to make sure it's the right match for you and that you can support them in exactly the way that you want. And before you know it, we're going through matching panel. We actually got a no the first time, and that was an issue of process. we don't need to go into the detail of it, but basically our social workers were from one authority, we were panelled in another, their processes were slightly different, and we had to go back and have another meeting, and everything was fine in the end. But that's a big hit as well, because it changed the date that we were looking at going on leave and everything, so it threw everything into the mix. And then before I knew it, it was January and there were 3 kids moving in with us, and the roller coaster started, and it was exhausting, it was tiring, but it's kids, isn't it? And years later, we're now a family, and we have good days and bad days, but so does every family, so does every kids. And I think one really important thing to reflect on, there's many times when I'm looking at my kids having a meltdown and I'm thinking, is it me? Have I done something wrong? Is it because you're adopted? Is it previous trauma? What's going on here? And you know what? Sometimes it is, but like 99% of the time it is because you're tired, you're hungry, you're thirsty. It's just those basics about getting them right. And me and my husband have 3 beautiful children. We adopted them at the ages of 2, 3, 4, and we've not had a full night's sleep since, but we'd never change that for the world.